Today, we're gonna talk about one of the most notorious criminals in the world, Ted Bundy. So after a bad breakup, this man started slaying a bunch of college girls in the Seattle area before starting a national execution tour where he traveled around to a few other states and knocked out other women in the same way. After he was sent to jail, Ted escaped twice. During his second breakout, he fled to Florida, snuffed some more girls, and was sent to trial again. In all of his trials, Ted represented himself and tried to charm the jury with his good looks. Let's get to it. Ted Bundy was born in Vermont in 1946. He never knew who his real dad was, and his mom, Louise, wasn't married when she had him. This was super scandalous at the time, so Louise brought him to her parents who raised Ted as an adopted child. Yeah, the grandparents literally made Ted believe he was theirs, which meant he thought his mom was his sister. That had to be so weird once he found out. So Ted was partially raised by his grandparents, but eventually went on to live with his mom. They moved to Tacoma, Washington, where Louise married a man named Johnny Bundy, who formally adopted Ted as his son. Ted was a bit of an outcast as a kid and was super fascinated by horror, executions, and other gory topics, which seems to be a trend for these creeps. So if any of you have kids out there who are super into the afterlife or other morbid things, you better sleep with one eye open. Anyway, Ted was a bit of an oddball. He was pretty antisocial and even liked to peep through his neighbors' windows. In 1972, Ted graduated from the University of Washington for psychology. Okay, so it's interesting that Ted majored in psychology because the dude was crazy, but he definitely used that knowledge to his advantage for his crimes. In college, Ted met a young California girl with a middle part who was super wealthy, beautiful, and classy. This was a big deal for Ted because he came from a low-income working-class family. Ted and his rich GF dated for a while, but she broke up with him, and he was devastated. This anger is said to be one of the leading factors that fueled his criminal acts, and most of his victims that he would go on to attack resembled his ex, all the way down to the middle part. Yo, I don't care how pissed you are about a breakup, don't go slaying other people that look like your ex. Ted graduated college in 1972. He got accepted to law school, but ended up dropping out. Around the same time, he became actively involved in politics and started to climb his way up the social ladder. Ted was known as a bright, charming, and charismatic guy next door. But even though he appeared to be a super intelligent and trustworthy dude, Ted was really a criminal mastermind who performed some of the most gruesome acts in the country. See, these criminals always put up a front and try to catfish the world. Personally, I could see right through Ted, but everyone else at the time thought he was the most suave man on the planet. In 1973, Ted got back together with his first girlfriend, you know, the one with the middle part who dumped him. They rekindled their relationship while Ted was on a trip in California for some Republican campaign and dated long distance for a year, while Ted was still with Liz. And both girls had no idea about the other. After Ted and his California girl had been dating for a year, Ted proposed. She said yes, but 2 weeks later, he completely ghosted her and dumped her. Later, Ted claimed he only got back with that girl to prove to himself that he could marry her if he wanted to. Ted is such a sleazebag. So most people believe Ted started snuffing people when he was a teenager, but the first slaying he was linked to took place in February of 1974. Linda Healy, a young woman who also went to the University of Washington, went missing one morning and was never found alive again. She wasn't the type of person who would just disappear, so her friends and family started freaking out. At the time, no one knew it was Ted, and investigators couldn't really figure out what happened or where Linda was, so this event sent the whole town into shock. But Ted was just getting started. Ted continued to prey on young girls from the same college. Girls started disappearing left and right. In fact, in the first half of 1974, one girl was getting snatched up each month. So a lot of times, Ted would lure these girls into his Volkswagen Bug by pretending to be injured and asking for help. He would literally wear a sling on his arm or a fake cast on his leg and even used crutches. He also made a lot of these girls think he was a police officer or firefighter to gain their trust. Once the girls got in his car, Ted would hit them with a crowbar or pipe and handcuff them before driving them away to take them to their resting place. He even took the passenger seat out of his car so the girls could lay down on the floor without anyone seeing them. Hey ladies, all aboard the execution mobile. People also say he kept the skulls of some of his decapitated victims in his apartment. So if you can't already tell by this point, Ted is a sicko who needs to be stopped. And he also needs some help in the world of interior design because real human skulls shouldn't be on display in your home. So after his first alleged victim was iced, Ted went on to snatch up at least 7 more young college women in the Pacific Northwest. 2 of the girls Ted abducted were snatched up on the same day at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle. One of the witnesses questioned from this incident said he talked to the perp who went by the name Ted. Ted apparently talked in a British accent too. Pip pip cheerio, have you seen a girl with a middle part that I can abduct and slay? During their various interviews with witnesses, investigators found out all of the girls who went missing were seen talking to a handsome, dark-haired man in a tan Beetle, aka they last saw the girls with Ted. From the interviews, various sketches were made of the perp who looked just like Ted. Ted's girlfriend, Liz, saw the sketch and read the description of the suspect and his car and thought her boyfriend might have been the guy they were looking for. That had to be such a scary realization for her. And what do you do at that point? Rat him out to the police, break up with him, and risk becoming his next victim? Well, Liz decided to reach out to the police about her suspicion. Ted's professor and one of his co-workers also called him into the cops. So the police got a bunch of calls from people who thought Ted might be the suspect they were looking for. But since Ted was a smart and attractive law student who worked in politics and had no criminal record, officials didn't think it was really him. After his many gruesome crimes in Oregon and Washington, Ted decided to move to Utah and go back to law school. Well, right around the time Ted moved, young girls coincidentally started disappearing in Utah. I'm no detective, but I think Ted had something to do with those disappearances. And he did. In Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, Ted snuffed at least 9 women, one of whom was the daughter of the police chief. So some of the girls were whacked immediately, others were kept alive for days to be repeatedly abused before taking the final blow. It's said that Ted even put makeup on the girls and washed their hair before dumping their bodies. Okay, that is way too far. And did this guy just want to be a cosmetologist? While Ted was in Utah, a bunch of his victims' remains were found. The first 3 skeletal remains were discovered by a hunter in Issaquah, Washington. A while after that, 4 more victims' bones were found on Taylor Mountain in Washington. They all appear to have suffered severe blunt force trauma. So Ted kept his whole act up until 1975, when a police officer tried to pull him over for a routine traffic violation. Ted tried to speed away, but the cop eventually got him to stop and searched his car. In his car was a ski mask, ice pick, crowbar, trash bags, rope, and a set of handcuffs. Officials also noticed that Ted's car matched the description of the car involved in the abduction of a woman in 1974. In this abduction, a girl named Carol was approached at a mall by Ted, who was pretending to be a police officer. Carol went out and looked in her car, but nothing was missing. Ted told her she still needed to go with him in his Volkswagen Bug to file a police report. She was a bit skeeved out, but must have assumed he was in an undercover car or something and got in his Bug. Wait, what the hell? She got in the car? Did this girl know you don't have to file a police report for fake robberies? Okay, so Ted drove off with Carol, and he definitely wasn't headed for the police station. While he was driving, Ted tried to put cuffs on Carol, but there was a bit of a struggle and he ended up putting both handcuffs on one wrist. Because of that, Carol was able to open the door and escape. She immediately went to the police to report the crime. Since Ted couldn't whack Carol, he snatched up another victim that same day and executed her. At the scene of this girl's disappearance, police found a key that belonged to the handcuffs that were on Carol's wrists. OMG, this guy is a nutso. He literally couldn't just snag Carol and leave it at that. No, he needed to get his villainy fix with a full-on execution. Well, at least the cops know those two crimes were connected. After the cops found the sketchy weapons in his car, investigators were able to get a search warrant for Ted's apartment, where they found a brochure for the Wildwood Inn, the location of one of his many slayings. They also found a playbill for a play that one of his victims saw the night she was snuffed. But police didn't have sufficient enough evidence to detain Ted, so he was placed under 24-hour surveillance. A few detectives then flew to Seattle to interview Liz. Some of the items she mentioned included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris, and a meat cleaver that wasn't used for cooking. Why was she still with this man? Those are all major signals to get out and never look back. So about 2 months after the sketchy weapons were found in Ted's car, he was put in a lineup and identified by Carol and a few other witnesses. With that, he was charged for abducting Carol and received a 15-year prison sentence. So while Ted was in jail for abducting Carol, he was indicted for slaying one of his many other victims. Since he went to law school, he decided to represent himself in court, which I can't believe they let a psycho executioner represent himself in his own trial. That seems so backwards. But things are about to get so much crazier. So one day in jail, Ted asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. While he was doing his research on a case that he lived through, Ted found out a way to escape and decided to act on it. He jumped out of the window on the second story. When he landed, he hurt his ankle, but that didn't stop him. After his wonky landing, Ted took off some of his clothes and ran for the mountains. So Ted broke into a cabin in the mountains where he stole some clothes, a bit of food, and a rifle. Because, duh. He stayed there for a night and then ran around the woods for a few days before he stole someone's car. On his drive to Aspen, Colorado, Ted was super sleep deprived and his ankle was throbbing, so he started swerving the car. Cops saw the swerving car, pulled it over, realized it was Ted, and sent him back to jail. But then, Ted broke out of jail again. OMG, this guy just doesn't stop. Less than a month after that, Ted abducted and iced a 12-year-old little girl, which was his last known slaying. The evidence that sealed the deal were the bite marks found on one of the girl's bodies. They were an exact match for Ted's set of chompers. Ted was charged for the 2 sorority girl slayings and received an execution sentence for each. He was also tried for a 3rd slaying where he was also found guilty. During all of his Florida trials, Ted represented himself, even though he wasn't a real lawyer because he never finished law school. Ted became pretty famous from these trials. People were swooning over his good looks and charming nature. Okay, Ted wasn't ugly, but I've also seen much prettier dudes than him. But apparently one girl was so smitten with Ted because she married him during his trials. What? Ted's wife eventually realized her husband was guilty of all of those slayings. You think? And divorced him 3 years before his execution date. During his time in jail, Ted was interviewed on tape by a journalist. These are the infamous Ted Bundy tapes. There are about 150 hours of footage where Ted talked in detail about his gruesome acts. But the whole time, he spoke in 3rd person, and all of his stories were hypothetical. Give it up, dude. We know it's you. Well, he eventually did confess. In the end, Ted was linked to a total of 36 executions across 7 states. About half of his victims' remains were found, and the other half have yet to be discovered. Honestly though, I'm just glad he was caught for good. He did really awful things to so many women who didn't deserve any of it. And for what? Revenge on an ex-girlfriend? Not worth it, dude. But you know what is worth it? Stuffed peppers. Stay safe out there.